Okay, in this podcast, I want to talk about Lend-Lease and the U.S. program, Lend-Lease programs, one of the most successful foreign policy slash military initiatives, really in the history of the United States and arguably in the history of the world. And like I said in class on Monday, a thumbnail. A thumbnail kind of description or a bumper sticker kind of description of World War II is that the victory over Nazi Germany was achieved through the economic and industrial power of the United States and the lives of over 20 million Soviets, both civilian and military. Now, I don't mean to slight the American military, members of the American military that died overseas, also the British and the French, other Allied powers. And I don't mean to slight the Soviet Union industrial capacity or completely ignore it. For instance, the Soviet Union actually preferred their tanks to our tanks. One of the reasons was the first group of tanks that we sent over there were gas powered, and the Soviets created the T-34 tank, which was diesel powered. And the big problem with the gas powered tank was it would explode if it was hit by a shell, where diesel doesn't burn as fiercely as fuel. So the Soviets actually preferred their tanks. They preferred their type of machine gun. But that's not to say the U.S. didn't play a key role in the Soviet victory. And the bumper sticker summary of that is mobility. What the U.S. provided the Soviet Union in terms of mobility, also in terms of communication, also in terms of food. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in this podcast. Now, you might remember that Roosevelt announced the Lend-Lease program a month after he was elected to his third term as president. He kind of promoted it by saying, and I've talked about this before, that Lend-Lease was a way to keep the United States out of the war in Europe. That if your neighbor's house is on fire and he comes and asks for a hose, you don't say, how much will you pay me for the hose? You lend him the hose, and the neighbor gives the hose back when he's done. It was this, very Churchill was just kind of, well, Churchill too, but Roosevelt was kind of just very brilliant at these homey little kind of geopolitical metaphors. And the reason that he announces Lend-Lease in December of 1940 is the British had literally run out of money. They'd run out of gold. They didn't. You might remember in my isolationist lectures that Congress had passed cash carry legislation, that any goods of belligerent power purchased in the U.S. had to be paid for in cash and carried in the holds of the belligerent ships, the British ships, etc. And this was to avoid the supposed mistakes of World War One. But England can't do cash carry anymore in December of 1940 because it literally has run out of money. It has no more gold in its account. And so Churchill has to come begging to Roosevelt. Now, the Soviets aren't part of the equation yet. And I don't think anyone really ultimately realized, not even Roosevelt, how significant the US aid to the Soviet Union would be. Ultimately, the United States spent $50 billion, $50 billion on Lend-Lease supplies to other 38 countries ultimately in World War II. And over $11 billion of the Lend-Lease supplies went to the Soviet Union. And in today's money, that would be something like well over $11 billion would today, with inflation, translate into something like $250 billion. So that's a fair amount of money that the U.S. spent on the Soviet Union. Also, of course, England's getting quite a bit of aid. China gets quite a bit of aid as well. As I said before, ultimately the U.S. supplies 38 different nations with Lend-Lease support, and uh, uh, basically, this is money that the United States and supplies, really. It's not the money per se, it's the supplies. Um, these are supplies that the United States gave to its ally powers. Um, Pretty incredible if you think about it. And it just shows the industrial might of the United States. It cannot be overstated how awesome the industrial might of the United States was during World War II. It is truly an incredible story. And one of the things that had happened is American factories had been idle for most of the 1930s because of the Great Depression. And there was tremendous excess capacity that disappeared once World War II started, once Lend-Lease started. Government money now was priming the pump, as the economists say. Government money was pouring into U.S. industry. And as one of the offshoots of that, which I don't think was really thought of at the time, was that U.S. unemployment goes from about 15%, 15%, in 1940 to right around 1% in 1943. U.S. by the middle of World War II, U.S. unemployment was the lowest it has ever been in U.S. history, either before or since. And it's also during this period that you start to have women moving into factory jobs. The famous Rosie the Riveter. I'll talk about this in later lectures. But Rosie the Riveter wasn't just making planes and other kinds of munitions for U.S. troops. Rosie the Riveter was also making a number of military goods for Soviet troops as well, and for British troops and French troops and Chinese troops. So Lend-Lease is just an extraordinary moment in the history of the United States, and it was brilliantly successful, and it was really wildly generous, but at the same time, not only was it altruistic in the sense that the U.S. Was helping these other nations, but the U.S. was also helping itself because the Allies are victorious. And as I said before, economically, what happens in the United States during World War II is there's this amazing economic boom. There's basically full employment. The Great Depression becomes a distant memory. I don't know if it's a distant memory, but it becomes a memory. People have money in the bank. Folks are working and having better jobs than they had ever had before. And I'm talking about women, African Americans, Mexican Americans. And so the rest of the world is just suffering intensely during World War II. But the United States, although we do lose hundreds of thousands of our servicemen, and some service women, which is, of course, a tragedy. But economically, the United States just does incredibly well during World War II. And it comes out of World War II by far the most economically and militarily powerful nation on earth. So this is one of the great contradictions of World War II, and one of the really fascinating things about it. So the U.S. does really quite well. So I'm going to stop this podcast and move on to a next one, and I'm going to get to the Soviet Union. But take-home point, of the $50 billion the U.S. awards or gives away to its allies in terms of all kinds of supplies, 11, I said, did I say million, $50 billion. $11 billion goes to the Soviet Union, which in today's money would be something like $250 billion, a very significant amount of money that played a huge consequence in the ability of the Soviets to fight.